Adam, thanks for joining us.
This is like an annual tradition, Danny.
It is an
You
annual
and me,
tradition,
end of the year.
and I always look forward to it.
Me too.
So, we're going to talk about the year that was in biotech, what's ahead for 2021. This was perhaps the strangest and most eventful year since we started doing this. Let's start with COVID. This was a year both defined by and shaped by the pandemic. Before we talk about any therapies or vaccines, what have you made about the response in general? And what do you think it tells us about our ability to respond to future pandemics?
I guess I look at it in a few different ways. I mean, if I really want to depress myself, I guess I think about, the really sort of poor performance, or the poor way that the poor response of the United States, and sort of how we dealt with with the pandemic. I mean, did you ever think that mask wearing would become like a political issue? I mean, maybe that's the worst distillation of everything that's happened this year. And it just seems like such a waste, doesn't it, that we were not able to come together as a country to deal with this crisis in a way that would get us through it relatively quickly. Obviously it was always going to be a struggle, but I think it was prolonged, and more people got sick, and certainly more people died than was necessary, and that's a tragedy. So I think you can't start a conversation like this without saying something like that. On the more hopeful side, you look at the vaccines, and you think that we went from learning about the virus in like late December, January, sequencing the virus, and then now seeing people vaccinated with two different vaccines that are highly effective in the span of 11 months, which is phenomenal. I think that speaks to obviously we are biotech people. We cover the industry, and so it speaks to the ability of drug makers, biotech industry to do this, to basically get us, or start to get us out of this crisis.
Well, last I checked, 1.7 million deaths worldwide, 320,000 deaths in the United States. As you mentioned, we've seen the development and approval of effective vaccines in an impressive time. Let me ask you a newsroom editor question. Who are the winners and losers?
Define winners and losers in this.
Well, I mean, who comes out of this pandemic as having performed above and beyond, and where have we seen failures on either the industry side, the regulatory side,
well, I mean, unfortunately, I think we all are sort of losers because of this thing that happened to us, right? I mean, I think we can't, I don't want to sort of say somebody actually like wins out of this thing, but I mean, if you had to sort of applaud some people, I mean, certainly, I would say, the drug makers, the biotech companies who've sort of definitely moved quickly to develop these vaccines or therapeutics. I think that, it's the only way that we're really going to get out of this is to have vaccines and therapeutics that are going to be able to, treat people, vaccinate, protect us from future infections. So, I mean, I think that's a win. Who else? I mean, I don't know who else has sort of shown themselves to be winners. Look, I mean, I would say, I think you have to sort of say that, Operation Warp Speed, for all of like the fact that, Trump handled this pandemic so badly, just horribly, the fact is, I think that Operation Warp Speed did help facilitate the development, particularly on the vaccine side, of getting the government involved in the ways that they could support the drug makers and the people who are developing the vaccines. I think in that way, I think Operation Warp Speed was a success. We'll see how well the distribution of the vaccination programs go, but I mean, I would give them, high marks for that program and the way that it helped to, kind of accelerate the development of the vaccines.
A lot of focus obviously have been on the vaccines of late, but many companies have been working to repurpose therapies that might have value in COVID-19. Is there anything on the therapeutic side that you found compelling?
I think on the therapeutic side, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag, and maybe kind of a disappointment if you think about it. I mean, I think back to kind of, I guess, the early spring, middle of spring, like kind of like March, April, May, where I think we were really excited about the potential for some antivirals. We got remdesivir came out, and I think remdesivir came out at a time when like there was literally nothing, and it came at a time when, if you remember, hospitals, particularly in the Northeast, were were just overflowing with patients. So there was a lot of excitement about remdesivir, but the drug itself was not all that effective, right? And I think we're sort of learning that. I think we knew that at the time, but it was really the only thing. And then since then, we've had the antibodies that have come out. We've got the Regeneron antibody, we've got the Lilly antibody, and they seem to be okay. I don't see anybody necessarily like jumping up and down that these are like the answer. And the problems that we're seeing now is that now that they're out under EUA, they've got conditional approval, is that it's difficult to find patients it's difficult to treat patients with them, right? Because these are infusions, and the hospitals are not really set up for infusions to infuse these drugs. You got to bring them into the hospital, and you don't want to bring COVID patients in. So like it's been difficult. And, we've heard stories that, that the antibodies are kind of sitting on the shelves and they're not being used as much. So, we've seen some drugs repurposed, and so I would say that, it's a little bit, like I said, I think it's a mixed bag. That I think it probably, there's still a lot more work to be done on the therapeutic side. I mean, I think what we really need is we need a better antiviral is what we really need. We need something like a really effective Tamiflu. Like Tamiflu is not the most effective drug for the flu, but like if you get the flu, you can go get Tamiflu. You can go to your doctor can prescribe it. You can go to your drugstore. You can get it. It can shorten the flu. It could make it less severe. That's what we really need. We need like an antiviral, a good antiviral against COVID that, if you're showing signs or symptoms of COVID, your doctor can prescribe it. You can go get it, take it orally. There are a few more antivirals that are in clinical trials now. We haven't seen the data yet. So hopefully we will get something like that, because I think that will be really important.
We started the year with the pharmaceutical industry in the toilet. There's been a fair bit of goodwill towards the industry from its response to the pandemic. How lasting do you think this will be? And perhaps the better question will be, what are they going to do to blow it?
Wow, Danny, you're just like, Mr. Positivity there. Well, look, from a stock market perspective, it's been an incredible year, right? For the biotech and drug makers. I mean, they, vastly outperforming the broader indices. It seems like, literally like you can throw a dart at a stock and it goes up. I mean, it's been incredible. And then there's been just tons and tons of money that have flown that have sort of come into the sector, right? Whether it's, investors putting money into the sector, it's, IPOs, and on the private side, like VCs and all. I mean, there's just tons and tons of money that's flooding in. Whether that continues, I don't really have a crystal ball to be able to say that. I would say that, for a large, a lot of it has to do with not only sort of macro reasons that, the Fed and the government have just sort of are set up in a way that just are pushing the stock market higher and higher. So it's kind of non-drug biotech reasons for why this is happening. The drug sector is also, pretty defensive, in a bad economy, people still take their medicines. So it's, you've had a lot of investors who have kind of seen pharma and biotech as kind of a defensive sector. Now that may change if the economy improves, or we get out of COVID in 2021, and we start emerging some of the sectors which were really beaten down in the economy. Investors may start moving their money into those sectors and out of biotech. So that could be something to watch in 2021. And then valuations, valuations in biotech have gotten kind of crazy. And the problem there is that, when you need more money, you have to keep raising money. And will these companies be able to continue to raise money at higher and higher valuations? At some point, they may not be able to do that.
Nevertheless, as you note, it's been a record year of finance for the industry. IPOs have gone crazy. The NASDAQ Biotech's at near record highs, if not record highs. The money that's been pouring into early stage companies are mind blowing. So it's not just people betting on the market here or COVID profits, but do you see other things driving this? I mean, it's not a defensive play to sink $100 million into a startup that's 5 years away from the clinic.
No, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the things that, you're seeing more and more of is you're seeing now some private startup gets $100 million in some, Series A round. It's not even a big deal anymore, right? I mean, we don't even blink. And we see preclinical companies going public with billion-dollar valuations. Again, they're not even in the clinic yet, right? I was joking with someone that the old $300 million market cap is the new $1 billion market cap. I don't know how long that could last. I mean, it's, again, I think it's just being driven by the fact that, people see, this, to see the growth, and they see what's going on with COVID, and they see all this innovation, and they want to be part of that. And it's working right now. It doesn't mean that it works forever. There seems to be this insatiable demand for IPOs. I don't know if that can, last forever, but it's, as long as they continue to work, I guess it will. I mean, that sounds like a stupid answer. Of course it will work until it doesn't, but I don't know when it doesn't. I don't know when it switches over.
It's been a very solid year for new drug approvals, but we've also seen a lot of trials halted during the year because of the pandemic. At what point do you think will they affect the flow of new approvals, or will they avoid that?
I think early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of clinical trials that were delayed. They were put on hold. I mean, for obvious reasons that, that we were in this crisis and you couldn't enroll patients or you couldn't treat patients. So I think that as time went on, companies have learned to adapt to the environment. As I talk to companies, they seem to have been able to, both kind of change their clinical trials in terms of either maybe the way that they were monitoring patients. They've been working with the FDA, who's kind of taken a flexible attitude towards this. So I think it's gotten a lot better, where clinical trials have restarted. New clinical trials have started. I don't think it's really impacted the industry as much as maybe people had worried about, if you think back to March and April. On the FDA side, it's been a pretty good year for approvals. It hasn't been a record-setting year. We've also seen a lot of drugs get rejected, not necessarily for efficacy, although we see that, but there's been a lot of manufacturing issues that have come up. Particularly when it comes to sort of gene therapies. We've seen some hiccups on the manufacturing side, kind of CMC side, quality control. We've had some issues where, manufacturing plants have not been inspected, again, because of COVID. The FDA is obviously under a lot of pressure to kind of focus its attention on COVID, and hasn't been able to do some other things that they normally do. So we've seen some issues where delays of approvals because of, manufacturing plants haven't been inspected. Again, that hopefully will work itself out as kind of things get back to normal.
It looked like it was going to be a relatively dull year for M&A with a lack of blockbuster deals. Gilead's $21 billion acquisition of Immunomedics only upstaged by AstraZeneca's announcement of its $39 billion acquisition of Alexion. What do you think of those two deals, and what did they tell you?
It was I don't know, is it an okay? Is that a way to describe it? It was an okay year for M&A. I mean, you're right. That last, the Alexion deal kind of was a nice way to end the year. Those deals seem fine. I think what it kind of shows you, is we've got this issue where, you've got the larger cap biotech companies, which are really having a hard time figuring out how to grow. And, they're doing all kinds of things, partnerships, and they're doing smaller deals. Alexion was an issue where, they were actually growing pretty decently, and they were diversified. I think operationally they were doing fine, but I think that they weren't getting a lot of credit for it. And there had been some pressure, investor pressure to, basically to figure out what to do. And, they ended up selling themselves. So you probably will see more of that. Like, I think next year, one of the big things that I'm watching for next year is looking at what happens to Biogen, for instance, right? So we've got aducanumab, which has got its FDA approval decision date in the beginning of March. I don't think that drug is going to get approved, although you never know. It could get approved. But I think most people, if you ask, I think the consensus is that it won't. And if they don't get that drug approved, then what does Biogen do, right? They've been in this position where they're even a more desperate position. So you could either see them being sold or having to kind of do some kind of big M&A. I kind of see Amgen. I mean, Amgen's not in that sort of dire straits, but Amgen hasn't done a really big acquisition in I don't know. It's been a long time. I think Onyx was like the last big acquisition that they did. And so, are they going to go out and do something? I think, that's another company that you could see maybe doing something in 2021. Although I always make these predictions and they never turn out right. So don't listen to me.
Welcome to the club. It wouldn't be Christmas without your list of best and worst CEOs. This year, you've got two for each category, a COVID and a non-COVID selection by your readers. Who came in the best spot and why?
On the best side on COVID, what I did, and it's this is sort of a no-brainer, is kind of highlight the CEOs who led the efforts to develop the COVID vaccines, right? So, Albert Bourla at Pfizer, Ugur Sahin at Biotech, which is Pfizer's partner, and then Stefan Bancel at Moderna. I mean, it's again. Where would we be today? I mean, I hate to think about where we would be today without the vaccines, being approved and rolling out these days. That was super important.
And how about on the non-COVID side?
So on the non-COVID side, it's funny when I do these best, in a sort of in a normal year, when I do the best CEO things, it's oftentimes a CEO who sold this company for a lot of money, right? Because that awards shareholders and everyone's happy. And so, this year, the three nominees for best CEO were Behzad Agazadeh from Immunomedics. They sold out to Gilead. You had Tassos Giannakakis from Myocardia, again, another M&A deal. But then I had Sam Kulkarni from CRISPR Therapeutics, and that's not an M&A, but it's just a great story of kind of this potential for CRISPR-based therapeutics to cure diseases. They had some really fantastic data in December with their one-time CRISPR-based therapy to treat beta thalassemia and sickle cell disease. That's partnered with Vertex. So, I stuck him on there because I think they've done a really good job of kind of moving forward with this CRISPR-based treatments, kind of in some ways separating themselves from some of the other CRISPR-based companies in terms of getting data out into the, getting into the clinic and getting data out. So he was a nominee, and actually, my readers vote, and Sam Kulkarni from CRISPR Therapeutics won. And
on the worst CEO side?
So the worst CEO side. So, I picked, so for the COVID category, so it was Nader Pourhassan from Cytodyn, and the less I say about him, the better. Joseph Kim from Inovio Pharmaceuticals and Henry Yee from Sorrento, and those three are all examples, I think, of companies that have sort of tried to exploit the COVID crisis, and gotten in way, way over their heads. You've seen tons of companies who've done this, and some companies do it for the good, some companies do it for the bad. Those three, I think, did it for the bad, and so they're on there. I had another COVID worst CEO candidate in that, and this is a big name, Pascal Soriot from AstraZeneca. Again, and if you look at AstraZeneca, actually they had a really good year, except for the way that they ran their COVID vaccine program. As you know, that's the program that's partnered with Oxford University, the UK. They've had all kinds of hiccups and issues, delays getting that vaccine rolled out. And so he landed on my worst list.
And for the non-COVID?
So non-COVID, probably I don't know if it was overwhelming, but like the winner on the quote unquote winner on worst CEO this year was Nick Leschly at Bluebird Bio. And that was a tough one because I personally like Nick, and I think that there was a time when Bluebird was like this kind of sterling example of gene therapy companies and kind of doing great science. But they've had a really bad run over like the last year, 18 months, where they've had tons of delays, manufacturing problems, and what I wrote in the piece, I said that that these groundbreaking gene therapies are great, except if they can't get out to the patients that need them, and that's what's happened to Bluebird this year, is that they've been able to develop these these therapies for patients, but yet delays and snafus and problems that they've had have kind of caused these things to get pushed back and so they're not reaching the patients who need them, and for that reason Nick was worst CEO.
We've had a presidential election this year. New leadership is headed to Washington. Will this have consequences for the pharmaceutical industry? And with the Senate in the balance in the Georgia senatorial runoff, will that have meaningful consequences?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, on a more hopeful note, I would think that, and I think we've seen this already, in that Biden has made it clear that science is not going to be a 4-letter word. Like scientists are going to be put in charge of COVID and other things where they need to be, and he's going to listen to the scientists. So I think from that perspective, I think we all should be pretty pleased with what's going to happen over the next 4 years. And I think you could see that just in his early picks for, certain, cabinet level posts and stuff, where it seems like, he's got some competent people who he's trying to bring in. You mentioned Georgia. Obviously, a lot of the sort of policy issues will come down to what can get through, and that will be determined by, who controls the Senate. And so we still have to wait to see what happens in the Georgia runoff elections and to see what happens there. I think that the pharmaceutical and biotech sectors would be happy with a split government, because the likelihood that there's consensus on drug pricing issues is probably a lot less likely under a sort of a split government. So we'll see how that plays out.
So I understand you spent some time on Twitter.
Oh yeah, man, Twitter this year has been tough, I got to tell you.
So one of the things that I found interesting was, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, biotech companies were quick to treat things like Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any social awakening in biotech? And do you see this playing out in the C-suite or in the makeup of clinical trials in 2021?
I think you're right in that, companies were quick to kind of go out there and be supportive and say Black Lives Matter, and then the rest of the stuff sort of has to follow. One of the things that we started doing this year, again, in response to a lot of this, is, we started asking companies for the gender and racial breakdown of the patients and participants in their clinical trials. Because I think historically we know that, Black people and other peoples of color are underrepresented in clinical trials. It's been a longstanding issue with the way clinical trials are run. We haven't recruited people. These are predominantly patients who come in are predominantly white,
and male.
Well, yeah. And so we decided as a policy now is that, like, whenever we write about a clinical trial, we want to highlight the breakdowns by race and by gender, just to and not like in like a value sort of way, but just sort of to put the information out there. We feel like it's important to highlight. And I think it's a reminder when you see like, oh, clinical trial, and it was 80, it was, let's say 60% male and 78% white, and a smattering of black people and a smattering of Asian people, and, just that kind of thing, that it's a reminder that these companies need to do a better job. And I think they knew, and I think they know that, because when you ask them for that information, there's always this kind of uncomfortable, awkward silence before they read they read the data out to you, or the information out to you. So I think companies are aware of this, and all I can say is hopefully that we will start to see improvements on that score, and improvements in terms of recruiting, a diverse workforce as well. I mean, obviously that's a very important issue too.
You mentioned CRISPR earlier. The discoverers of CRISPR-Cas9 shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry this year. We've seen the start of clinical trials using in vivo gene editing in 2020. Mm-hmm. There are other technologies that are emerging that have the promise to have big impacts on the treatment of diseases. Anything you think will capture the imagination in 2021?
Well, yeah, you mentioned in vivo. I'm really interested to see. I don't know if the first data will come in 2021. I hope so. Maybe towards the end of the year, we may get some data on an in vivo approach. And for those people who maybe don't know what we're talking about, is kind of doing the gene editing inside the body instead of taking the cells out, editing them outside, and then putting them back in. So we should start seeing some of that data this year, and we'll see what it looks like. I think that's kind of potentially really exciting. What else do I want? What else am I looking for this year? CNS has been a big area. I think that continues to be an area, thing. In cancer, I think you're seeing a lot of stuff, a lot of the bispecifics, a lot of data, to the point where like there's just we just had the ASH meeting in December. Like I couldn't believe how much data there was on bispecifics. It's amazing how much there is. On the cell therapy side, CAR T, I would say, like, I don't want to say CAR T is like the old thing, but it's kind of it seems like it's starting to become a little bit. And now you're starting to see like, more of the off the shelf cell therapy stuff kind of coming out. Like, we're seeing early data, and then other cell therapies like, like natural killer cell, NK cell stuff. I think that's there was some pretty interesting early data at ASH this year. And so we should see more of that in 2021.
The JP Morgan Healthcare Conference is going virtual this year. The good news is you can get a room at the St. Francis this year for less than $200.
Yeah, I was going to say, what are hotel rates? Like you live out there.
I checked. It's less.
Is it?
$191 I saw for the week of JP Morgan.
Nice.
While we've gotten used to virtual conferences this year, do you think this will have a material effect on the ability of companies to raise money or make deals?
I'm really interested in kind of seeing how it all is going to play out. I don't know. Like, I'm trying to figure out what the sort of virtual JPM week will be like, because clearly you're not going to have that sort of buzz where everyone is in the same place and there's no cocktail parties and so that's all gone. But at the same time, I think that, I think what we've all learned is that, over Zoom and stuff, you can do a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, like that you can have meetings and you can watch presentations and in some ways it's more efficient to do it virtually than it is to sort of literally run around San Francisco from meeting to meeting. If you're sitting in your house and you're just dialing up Zoom calls, you can get a lot more done. So,
but the best things that happen are when you're going from the Park 55 to the Hilton to the St. Francis.
And I think you're absolutely right, Danny. And what I actually had said this to someone before. They said, like, what will you miss? And I said, I think what you miss is that spontaneous interaction, right? You miss running into the person who you haven't seen in a while, whether you run into them in the street or you run them into at a party or an event, and they tell you something that's really cool. Like, it sparks a conversation, and it might spark a deal, or for us as journalists, it may spark a story. You get like a really good scoop on something. Like, you just don't do that. You can't get that when I'm sitting in my bedroom, my made up office space. You can't do that. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to miss. I mean, I can sit here and watch a webcast of a company presentation, and I'll probably be more efficient about it. But you do miss that stuff, and I think that's the kind of stuff that like we'll all miss. But I wonder like, you know, whether missing that kind of stuff is enough to kind of get people to go back to JP Morgan in 2022, for instance. Like that's what I'm really interested in seeing, is like if people sort of, they come out of this year feeling like, wow, you know what? I don't really need to be there.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to the question.
Well, what are you going to be watching that week and beyond?
You know, I just hope that it will be, I mean, look, I just hope there'll be news. Like I just hope that there'll be stuff happening. And I do worry about that a little bit, that absent that kind of buzz that you get from all of us being together, that companies will not sort of treat this coming up sort of quote unquote JPM week the way that they normally would. And so we won't get the kind of news flow that we normally see. And, you know, ultimately that's what I like, because I want to be able to write about things. So, you know, I'm kind of going into this not really knowing what it's going to be like. I mean, I will sit, you know, I will be ready like that Monday morning, like I normally am. Now they're running it on East Coast time this year, so it's good for me, maybe less so for you. So I don't have to get up. You know, I used to get up at 3:00 in the morning out there, like to get ready for the news and stuff that would come out. And now I can sort of treat it like a normal work day here in Boston. So we'll see.
Adam Feuerstein, senior writer for Stat News. Adam, thanks as always.
Danny, it's always a pleasure. Thanks.